Hey, let's come back to preventive measures. And like I mentioned earlier, right, this is largely our effort in combating climate change so far. Is we're coming up with climate change policies to reduce the emission or the annual emission of greenhouse gas. Right. Looking back at chapter 12, this is again an IPCC report. Right, the goal is our main what we're trying to get under control, of course, is the CO2 or the greenhouse gas concentration. And in order for us to do that, we need to reduce the annual emission and following an emissions path. Right. Okay, here's a clearer picture on what that path looks like if we want to achieve a certain stabilization. Right. So, for example, if we want to achieve 450 parts per million, then we needed to peak our emission at 2020 and be on a downward, pretty dramatic downward emissions path since then. All right, so we kind of missed that point there. 550 parts per million. Then we will need to peak emission at 200 and about to 230. 2030, and then be on a downward emissions path. Then, okay. So what's the best way to do that? Right? If what's the best type of policy that we can choose to reduce the emission in order to stabilize our carbon concentration? Okay, so now back in chapter 8, we talked about all pollution control policies can be categorized into these into two main categories: command and control and market-based approach. Okay, now in the Clean Air Act, so the way that most societies have dealt with air pollution is taken the command and control approach, and those typically work well because we're dealing with local air pollution. So we're like the example with, if a Detroit factory is polluting sulfur dioxide, then the residents of Detroit has an incentive and can persuade the government, which has jurisdiction in Detroit. However, greenhouse gas is a global pollutant. Right? It's no country really has a jurisdiction or property rights to the atmosphere, which is the resource that is being consumed. And so, because of this and some of the other unique circumstances with greenhouse gas that we have mentioned, market-based approach, right, is going to be needed and will be the most efficient way of reducing carbon emission. Right. And also, so we're looking at the global side. Now, what about for individual countries? Well, it turns out that a market-based approach will still be the more efficient way of reducing carbon emission. Now, some of those details we talked about in chapter 8. We talk about the benefit of market-based approach versus a command and control. And so let me just emphasize that here is that remember, with command and control works well when an industry is mostly homogeneous, meaning that most of the firms in the industry are largely have the same cost, have the same profile, right? Mostly the same. However, when it comes to greenhouse gas, many different industries create greenhouse gas. Right? You have cement industry, agriculture. You have power producing, right? Power production, and so on. And so these are very heterogeneous firms in these industries that all produce greenhouse gas. And so because of that, so even if we don't have the jurisdiction problem, right, with the global greenhouse gas, right, even if we're just trying to reduce emission in our own country or even in our own state, a command and control approach is going to be very inefficient. Right? So we still want to rely on a market-based approach. Okay, now. So what economists has proposed is issuing or establishing a carbon dividend. And so here's a statement that gathered by hundreds of signed by thousands of economists. Now, economists don't really agree on a lot of things. So when you have over 3,000 economists agree on something, that typically is worth paying attention to. All right, so you can take a look at this link and just look at the names and then read the statement yourself. But basically, it boils down to something very simple. Right? It says it advocates for a market-based approach to prevent climate change, and largely because it is an externality and is a global common. And by using a market-based approach to establish a carbon dividend. So carbon dividend is really just a carbon price. It allows the market and individual countries, or each country, I should say, to recognize that there is a cost of burning fossil fuel. There is a cost, right? There is a cost that is generated when you spew carbon into the atmosphere. Right. And so now, right, so now we're going to dive into the two main types of market-based policy, right? One is the Pigrouvian tax style policy, and the other would be a tradable, excuse me, a tradable permit program.